Nobody in the international media talks about the tens of thousands of Israeli families who are effectively refugees inside their own country, the displaced people from the north, the displaced families from the south.
So this is personal. As a British citizen, you feel almost personal about it.
I feel very personal about it, and not just as a British citizen, but as a human being. Hamas is a fire. Hamas needs to be put out. It needs to be destroyed.
Buckle up for a roller coaster ride with Douglas Murray as he bulldozes through media bias and political correctness. Watch him skewer hypocrites, expose anti-Semitic undercurrents, and challenge the West's complacency. From Gaza's rockets to campus zealots, Murray pulls no punches. Witness the unraveling of liberal delusions and the stark reality of global threats. Is Israel alone in a sea of double standards? Are we sleepwalking into disaster? Murray's wit and wisdom cut through the noise, offering a wake-up call that'll leave you questioning everything. Don't miss this intellectual fireworks display.
Welcome to a very special episode of History for the Curious. Our podcast, which we started just over 2 years ago, myself with Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch, focuses on the last 3,000 years of Jewish history. Since the war started in Israel, we've veered off our conventional history episodes due to this whole saga being on everyone's minds all the time. Today we were honored to interview a very well-known and prominent voice advocating for Israel, Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray is an author and journalist based in London, and his book The Strange Death of Europe was a bestseller. Douglas is the associate editor of The Spectator, and he has written for many newspapers including The Times, The Sunday Times, The Wall Street Journal, and others. A prolific debater, Douglas has appeared on many platforms such as the British and American parliaments and even at the White House. Since the tragic massacre on October the 7th, Douglas has emerged as a resolute advocate for Israel, fearlessly championing its rights to exist and defend itself against terror. We often feel alone and vilified in global media, and hearing Douglas's voice on the most prominent platforms in the world gives us at least some comfort that there's someone out there who's willing to potentially risk everything in order to defend the truth.
Murray's razor-sharp critique slices through media buyers like a hot knife through butter. He exposes the absurd moral equivalence between Israel's defense and terrorist aggression. With anti-Semitism rising faster than a rocket from Gaza, can we afford to ignore history's lessons? As Western democracies sleepwalk through this crisis, Murray stands as a beacon of truth. Will we heed his warning or stumble blindly into another dark chapter?
It's a pleasure to meet you last night at the ICA, and thank you for your remarkable words last night, and thank you for all the amazing work, and thank you for hosting us today.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you both.
Thank you. So can I just start by asking the most, I guess, the question that's foremost on everyone's minds, at least in the Jewish community. You appeared on TV and on speaking engagements around the world, and probably the most visible or loudest pro-Israel voice globally. Why? Why have you devoted everything to fight this cause? And why indeed are you so clearly passionate about it?
Well, in a way, I'd turn around the question and say, why wouldn't you be? And who wouldn't be? I've covered a lot of wars in my life, and I've been in Israel during many wars, as well as during peacetime, since the 2006 Lebanon-Hezbollah war. And I certainly noticed then, 18 years ago now, the extraordinary disconnect between what I was seeing on the ground and what I was reading in the international media. And, it's very striking to me. I was in Ukraine last year, or the year before, and was with the Ukrainian forces as they were pushing back against the Russian advances, and I saw only international support for the Ukrainian army in their war against the aggressors. And I saw nobody saying that the Ukrainians should be more careful or shouldn't be allowed to win, or that really what we must do is to get to a ceasefire situation. Only in conflicts involving Israel does that happen. And when you say, why am I so motivated by it? Largely, I would say it's because I have an intense dislike of lies, and I'm motivated by searching for the truth. And if you are interested in searching for the truth, when it comes to conflicts involving the only Jewish state in the world and any of its enemies, you just see a sea of lies pushed out. And I believe that they're pushed out largely through intense animus, including bigotry towards the Jewish state. And I also think, as a second order, I'm motivated because I think that the people who are doing this and who always do this to the state of Israel when it's in a war are the same people who do the same thing to my country of Britain and to America and to all the Western democracies. There's an absolutely clear line of predictability. If somebody gives you their views on Palestinian, Hamas, Israel conflicts, you can guess where they are about Britain and about America and everything else. You can pretty much guess their views on capitalism, on Cuba these days. You can guess their attitudes on everything. This is a la carte bigotry.
So this is personal. As a British citizen, you feel almost personal about it.
I feel very personal about it, and not just as a British citizen, but as a human being.
How would you therefore understand the vast majority of your journalistic colleagues that don't seem to be able to differentiate right and wrong as clearly as you have? I mean, when you speak, obviously I've got loads of family in Israel, so I'm somewhat biased, but you as a more objective journalist who is so clearly differentiating between right and wrong.
Douglas Murray lambasts media bias against Israel, questioning why only Israel faces calls for restraint. He highlights the hypocrisy. Ukraine gets global support, yet Israel stands alone. Is this bias rooted in anti-Western sentiment? Murray argues it's predictable bigotry, extending to criticisms of Western democracies. Why can't journalists see the truth? His fiery defense demands reflection. Why is Israel uniquely vilified, and who gains from this decision?
And yet, as you said right at the beginning, the question should be flipped. Why are you so in a spotlight and you're not joined by the masses?
Well, I'd like to be. I am in some ways. I think the silent majority, as it's often described, I always wish was less silent, understands a lot of the things that I understand. It's a peculiarity of our era that it's unusual to see things as I see it among the commentariat, among the journalistic and political classes. I think it's a lot of things. If I was able to put it down to two groups, I would say that there's a group of journalists and others who find the Israel-Palestinian issue an enormously comfortable conflict to commentate on. Not to make it too simplistic, but, Syria is a pretty difficult conflict to cover, which is why pretty much since the murder of Marie Colvin, very few Western journalists were in Syria. Some of those who were fell into the hands of ISIS. The Ukraine war isn't much fun to cover. Most wars in the Middle East aren't. Very few journalists have made it to Yemen in the last few years, when about 400,000 people have been killed by Muslims, or Muslims by other Muslims. But the Israel-Palestinian issue, you can cover it. You can stay at the American Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem. You can have cocktails by the pool, and you can put on a flak jacket, stand outside, and report back to London or Washington from occupied East Jerusalem. It's quite a comfortable conflict in that way, and I don't say that lightly. Journalists overdo their bravery, and so that's one thing. The second thing is, I think, is the bigotry that exists, and I think a lot of people are entirely unaware of it. They obsess about this one country, and I just always want to ask them why. Where were you with the Uyghurs in China? Where were you when Assad was slaughtering many times the number of people who had been killed in every war involving Israel? Where were you on Yemen? Where were you on any of this? And the answer is you were nowhere. So the onus is on them, in my view, to explain why this is, why this peculiarity, why this fetish.
Murray skewers media bias for spotlighting Israel while ignoring other global atrocities. He questions why journalists flock to cover Israel-Palestine while conflicts like Yemen and Syria, with their staggering death tolls, go unnoticed. Where is the commentary on Uyghur oppression in China? Murray challenges this selective outrage, urging journalists to confront their narrow focus and unacknowledged bigotry. Why does Israel become the convenient target, while real horrors evade scrutiny?
Have you ever had occasion to speak or question some of these journalists who are involved in the Middle Eastern conflict and who are reporting in what you would really call a biased or a subjective fashion. Have you asked them, and what has been their response?
Yes, I mean, I've spoken to many of my colleagues across the media. And generally speaking, what it is that they go in and they know how to cover this conflict. The conflict always begins with Israel, not when Israel is attacked, but when it responds, as you know. I mean, I said on October the 7th to a friend, I think they'll probably give us a day, the world. They'll give us a day to say, oh, something terrible has happened. But sure enough, by the next day, by the Sunday, all of the world's media, Israel's retaliation, what will Israel's disproportionate reaction be, how will Israel... That's what they're interested in.
They were defending themselves before they actually made a move itself.
Yes, I mean, people, as we know, there were protests in London and in New York, where I was on the 7th, in Times Square the next day. They were protesting against Israel before Israel had done anything. All that had happened was that Israel had been attacked. But they're already onto it. They're already het up on this. I think they enjoy this line of story. I think they enjoy the line of, oh, what will Israel's terrifying response be? And there's lots of reasons for that, by the way. One of them, again, to go back to, is a technical one. I have a friend who's a Palestinian journalist who years ago wrote something critical of Yasser Arafat, and it was made very clear that he was never to return to the West Bank again. That's the same with any reporter for Sky or BBC. If they were to expose the corruption, not just of Hamas, but of the PLO, the PA, they would find it quite hard to operate in areas they would like to operate on. I do, by contrast, notice that the Israeli media, like the British and American media, has no problem criticizing its own leaders. So yes, you can... You can report on aspects of this conflict quite comfortably. There are other aspects on it you cannot report on quite comfortably. And this desire to sort of say, we will focus on the response, always leads to this just absolute skewing of the reporting, of the direction of the war. I've just written a piece in my column in The Spectator this week saying, we've heard a lot about Palestinian refugees in Gaza, and perhaps rightly so. But nobody in the international media talks about the tens of thousands of Israeli families who are effectively refugees inside their own country, the displaced people from the north, the displaced families from the south. The world media doesn't seem to care about this. One reason why, of course, as you both know, but some people listening might not, is that the Israeli government actually looks after the Israeli people who can't live in their houses because they're within rocket fire of Hezbollah or Hamas. The Hamas in Gaza noticeably does not seem to exercise the same duty of care to the people in Gaza, but people can draw their own conclusions from that.
I suppose that differentiates you massively from the other journalists who never bother to actually go to a place and see it with their own eyes.
No, they don't bother to speak to people.
Douglas Murray slams media bias, questioning why coverage starts with Israel's response, not the attack. He highlights the neglect of displaced Israelis, contrasting it with the focus on Gaza. Why ignore Israel's care for its citizens while Hamas neglects theirs? Murray reveals journalists' reluctance to challenge narratives, fearing access loss. Is this skewed reporting driven by convenience or cowardice? The truth remains obscured, demanding a re-evaluation of media integrity.
Final point on that, Piers Morgan has been very vocal, and you've appeared on his show many times regarding the war, and there was the sort of tone that was at the beginning was very much, post-massacre, and Israel has the right to defend itself and respond. But I've noticed himself and many others in the field haven't remained consistent as Israel has responded, and there's more of a moral quandary, as he seems to put it. But I think even going on the political side, David Cameron's letter that you mentioned last night at the dinner was surprising. I mean, I heard a speech from David Cameron on the early days of the war, even a few weeks after, and he was almost like it was Bibi Netanyahu speaking. We have to respond and we have to defend ourselves against terror. And then the letter yesterday just sort of sent a bit of a surprise.
These people David Cameron is weak. He was a very weak man. And I knew at the beginning that we would lose him within some weeks or months. I say we, I see everyone on the right side on this. I have very little sympathy with or interest in people who say you have a right to respond, and then once you start to respond, encourage you to not win. There's no point in starting a conflict. And I mean, of course, it was Hamas who started this conflict, but there's no point in responding in a conflict and not winning. There's absolutely no point in it. It is, as Benny Gantz said a couple of days ago, like putting out 3/4 of a fire. You don't put out 3/4 of a fire, you put out the whole fire. Hamas is a fire. Hamas needs to be put out. It needs to be destroyed. There's no point in destroying 3/4 of Hamas. The fire will start again next month, next year, 3 years down the line. So I have no sympathy for people like David Cameron, who at the beginning say, yes, you should respond, and then when you do respond, try to stop you from winning.
Douglas Murray lambasts figures like Piers Morgan and David Cameron for their fickle support of Israel. Initially backing Israel's defense, they falter when action is taken. Murray calls Cameron weak, insisting on a full victory against Hamas, likening it to extinguishing a fire completely. Why start if you won't finish? He ridicules those urging restraint mid-conflict, questioning if their inconsistency stems from fear or naivety.
You said at the beginning that you've been a great source of comfort to the Jewish people. Do you feel you've gotten anywhere with your advocacy in the bigger picture? Has it had an impact on politics, on people's mindset, on the general public?
I have no idea. It's not my place to judge. I'm not an advocate. I'm a writer. I say things as I see them. And if what I regard as the truth gets through to people, I'm extremely happy. That I wouldn't write and speak if I thought that I was speaking to no purpose. I believe that many people retain the capability, not everyone, but many people retain the capability to notice one lie amid a sea of untruths. And again, I wouldn't be a writer, I wouldn't do what I do if I thought it was hopeless. I wouldn't say what I regard as the truth if I thought that it was simply going to be drowned out by lies. And, many of the lies are quite straightforward. I mean, you mentioned Piers earlier, but he has this man, Mustafa Barghouti, on his show quite often, a man who's incapable of telling the truth. And also seems to have developed a sort of circular breathing technique so that he's uninterruptible. He just lies, I waved the PA's own budget in his face the other week on television, saying, this is the budget that provides the pay for slay, which provides the money to terrorists and their families, that goes up on an escalating scale depending on how many Jews you've killed. And depending on the number you've killed and how great your act of terrorism was, you'll get more money from the PA, which of course is funded by the British, European and American taxpayer, among others. And he just, of course, denied that was the case. Well, that's a lie. But I think that there are enough people, including, I hope, some Palestinians, who notice that money that is meant for them instead goes into the pockets of these corrupt groups like Hamas and the PA. I'm perfectly confident that truth wins out because it's happened in history.
Douglas insists he's merely a truth teller, not an advocate, and believes his words may resonate amidst a sea of lies. He confronts public figures like Mustafa Barghouti, exposing untruths on shows like Piers Morgan's, highlighting how Palestinian authorities misuse international funds to incentivize terrorism. He trusts that truth will eventually prevail, as it has throughout history. Will people awaken to these manipulations and demand accountability?
Fergus touched on before the global fascination with the Jewish people, which has, in essence, split the world. It's a Middle Eastern conflict, as you said many times before, and no one seems to care about any other massacre or genocide happening around the world unless there's Jews involved. Rabbi Hirsch, how would you explain such a phenomenon?
Well, I mean, if you're talking from a broader perspective, in other words, you're talking about anti-Semitism generally and historically, the way I would view it is that we have to bring in the spiritual element as well as the political, economic, and other concerns. And that makes it a constant. Meaning, if you go back in history, you will find that for 1,500 years, anti-Semitism was of a much more religious nature. and at a time where religion became less relevant, in Europe, for instance, it morphs into racial anti-Semitism, and from there into economic anti-Semitism, and now it's sort of anti-Israel. You find that, let's say, in the 1950s, the Jews are being accused in the United States in some quarters of being communist, and in the USSR of being capitalists. It's ubiquitous. Now, that doesn't mean that we should accept victimhood and that we should somehow give up the fight, but we need to bring an element of that to the response. Clearly, there is a political fight to be fought, but that lies at the base of it, and I don't think there is a catch-all response that would otherwise be able to adequately explain across the board the anti-Semitism that has existed, the longest hatred, as it's often referred to.
So the longest hatred just takes different forms, and every time you cut off its head, it will no doubt regrow in another form.
Absolutely.
Yes, I completely agree. I mean, if